thanks to COVID, now back with a vengeance. The gap between government revenue and spending is now forecast to be at its highest level since the end of the Second World War, necessitating borrowing of nearly 400 billion, reversing much of the painful progress over the past decade. Should we be worried? Now, a bit later, or ever? To get into all the detail of this, we've got David, Miatta, and Julian, bringing together thinkers from across the political and philosophical spectrum in true bright blue style. So do start asking your questions through Slido. The link and code are on the YouTube webpage. So I'm going to come to Julian first. And just where is this money coming from? Where are we borrowing it from? Who's giving it to us? You're muted, Julian.
Okay. What the government is doing is issuing large amounts of government bonds that are then bought by private investors. So basically, the money that is being raised is coming from private savings. And people are very willing to lend their money to the government at the moment because government debt is seen as a safe haven. And because the economy is weak, they don't see many opportunities to invest more productively or to spend. And that's the key reason why interest rates on government debt have remained very low. As it happens, the Bank of England has played a part here too, but perhaps not in the way that people think. It hasn't been printing money in order to buy bonds directly from the government. That would be direct deficit financing, and that's taboo at the moment. What it has been doing, though, is printing money to buy bonds from private investors and crediting their account at the central bank itself. So if you like, the Bank of England has acted as an intermediary, effectively swapping longer dated government debt for central bank reserves. So it's reduced the cost of financing a little bit by doing that. But at the end of the day, the reason why the government has been able to sell as many bonds as it has is not so much the role of the Bank of England. It's simply that there's loads of excess savings sloshing around the world economy because demand is so weak.
So David, you were obviously critical in the coalition government period, and deficit reduction was the people were frightened about the deficit and needed to be brought under control. So what's the kind of worst case scenario if the deficit gets out of control? Why is it such a bad thing if we don't keep a lid on it?
I think the first point to make is that we are in a different set of circumstances than we were in 2010. And my view is we do have to worry about the deficit, but not particularly this year. We are in exceptional circumstances. The markets understand that the world economy is weak, and as Julian says, there's lots of people who are prepared to buy our debt. The problem potentially comes down the line where if you are borrowing a lot of money, that if there is a lack of confidence in the economy for whatever reason, if there is concerns about the sustainability of public finances, that those costs might go up, that interest rates rise, that we don't get our debt away as cheaply and easily as we are at the moment. And the risk becomes that this becomes a very substantial part of public spending, that you find yourself in a vicious cycle, which is you need to bring your deficit down, but your borrowing costs are going up, and it becomes harder and harder. And now that's not the situation that we are in at the moment, but ultimately, if your public finances are not seen as sustainable, if there is a lack of confidence, then there is a price to be paid. And there's a question of judgment as to when do you get to that point. What will the market bear? But the concern that I have is not where we are at the moment. It's not where we're going to be next year. But as we come through this, as the economy stabilizes, if we find ourselves still with a structural deficit that's very high, in the end, you lose that confidence of the private investors who are at the moment happy to lend to us.
So, the consensus seems to be here that we aren't facing a fiscal emergency just yet. But Miatta, I presume you come from an intellectual tradition which says actually spending, you invest, and then over time, the government finances work themselves out. Is there a point in time where you would be worried about the level of the deficit? And what would that look like? I'm just trying to, do you think we could just keep spending and spending and spending and it work itself out? Or is there a cap that you see? And when would that be triggered? I'm interested to know that.
Yeah, so for me, I think the key question is not so much the level of the deficit. So everyone's fixating on this 400 billion, and I think that's the wrong thing to fixate on. What matters is the extent to which the cost of financing that deficit is sustainable. And we have this strange anomaly where, yes, the deficit is at historically high levels, but actually the cost of financing it is the lowest it's ever been historically. And that's what matters. So if you think about the OBR's assessment last week, we had the strange thing where, yes, the number of the deficit was high, but actually the cost of financing it this year was 20 billion less than we thought it was going to be before the pandemic. And that's my point. What matters is the sustainability of this. And that's the thing that government needs to focus on. And that's the thing that government needs to track. And I think, particularly in this period, I concur with everyone else, the priority really ought to be less the size of this thing and be, how do we get the economy working again? Because when we do get to thinking about actually, the cost of financing this sustainable or not, and what do we need to do, what really matters is the size of your economy and the extent to which, for example, you're generating tax receipts, because that's the thing that allows you to bear down on the structural deficit. So, I don't think we should focus on the big number. I think we should focus on the cost of financing it. And critically, the imperative has got to be getting your economy working again.
Okay, so let me just press you. We're in a different circumstances. The consensus seems to be this is different to post-financial crisis 2008. Did you think there was a fiscal emergency then which necessitated a deficit reduction, which was, in your mind, very severe? Do you see that we're in a different circumstance, or are you of the view that the solution then should have been to spend as we're doing now?
So we are in a different circumstance insofar as interest rates are much lower now than they were back in 2010. But I think actually the remedy to responding to the deficit in 2010 was the wrong one. So there are basically three ways in which you try to bear down on the deficit. You either cut, you either increase taxes, or you choose to increase tax receipts. You basically do a big fiscal stimulus. And I'd argue that what we did in 2009-10 was a fiscal stimulus. We then chose to, in that triangle, to kind of gear towards cuts and austerity, which I think was a wrong strategy. What that did is that it choked the recovery that was happening, it choked the growth that was happening. And I think the reason why it took us so long to bear down on the deficit was because we took that course of action. If you compare us, for example, to what the US did, where they sustained their level of fiscal stimulus, actually they were able to do the job of getting the economy working again, and therefore increasing tax receipts and bearing down on your structural deficit that way. So there are only ever three choices. And for me, the lesson of the last 10 years is that the cuts one is short term, because in the end, what will happen is that you have these kind of moments of crises or whatever, or the capacity to cut starts having an impact on the real economy, and then you chuck money back at the problem and you go back to where you were. And you're much better off thinking about the balance between increasing taxes, as painful as that is, and thinking about the ways in which you stimulate your economy to grow the pie and increase tax receipts.
So David, just thinking, if now is not the problem, when will be? So, some people say mid-2020s, and I suppose Rishi has already indicated that will have to be some belt tightening with the public sector freeze and the cut to the international aid budget. When do you think actually this is the year when we'll see real fiscal retrenchment? And what does that look like? Is it big spending cuts or more tax rises, or both?
Firstly, I should just say I do disagree with Miatta in terms of the characterization of what happened after 2010, but I won't dwell on that unless you want to come back to that. But to answer your question, Ryan, I think it's hard to put a precise date on when is the right time to address this, because that depends on progress with the economy, and there are two big uncertainties. One is the recovery from COVID, and that partly will depend upon where we are with the vaccine, the speed in which that is rolled out, Probably in the light of recent news, the OBR assessment is probably at the pessimistic end of where we will be on that. There's also Brexit and what's going to happen to that. What will be the level of disruption? What will that do to the UK economy? That's obviously a matter of some controversy, but there's clearly some uncertainty about that. So those are the two big risks and uncertainties that the economy faces. And unless we know where we are on that, it's hard to place a precise date on it. I am struck by the fact that there is probably a misalignment between the economic cycle and the political cycle. So my guess is economically, to the extent that you want to do something about the public finances, and I would, maybe 2023. If things go well, maybe 2022. But it's something of that order. But you're already into the second half of a parliament, and that is not traditionally when governments wish to do anything.
What's the composition then, David? Are we looking at spending cuts or tax rises?
I think it will be principally tax increases. We have gone through 10 years where spending has taken the greater burden. I think that was justified, but the fact is that it increasingly becomes harder to take money out of public spending. And indeed, one thing I would say is that the OBR's estimates of where public spending is, or more to the point, they as they have to accept the government's assessment on spending in many areas. I think that's going to be quite hard for the government to maintain the necessary discipline to meet their own targets on spending. I think there are going to be considerable spending pressures that will likely to move that beyond what is currently projected. And so that leaves taxes, and I think that that is essentially going to have to fill in the hole. We can't be precise as to what the size of that hole will be, and as I say, there is uncertainty over timing. But I think it will have to be taxes. And if you want to raise,
okay, I mean, just Julian, just thinking now, aren't tax rises going to be really bad for choking growth? Any form of tax rises that David's talking about, surely that's going to be bad for triggering economic growth in a kind of post-COVID world.
Absolutely. I think that any type of austerity, whether that's through tax increases or spending cuts, is going to be the wrong medicine for the foreseeable future. But stepping back a bit, I'm actually not sure there is a problem. There's definitely a longer term problem. If you look at other forecasts published by the OBR, their long-term economic forecasts, they do see a big problem because of the aging of the population, additional public spending on things like healthcare and state pensions. So there is a longer term issue to address. But as far as the outlook over the next few years is concerned, actually David touched on this. I think the OBR's central forecast that we obviously focus on, I think does now look far too pessimistic. Their upside scenario actually sees the debt GDP ratio fall well below 100% of GDP again over the next few years, and that upside scenario is driven by precisely the sorts of things that we've seen emerge over the last few days. Signs in particular that the new vaccine is being rolled out, and actually some of the recent economic data suggests that the impact of the second lockdown has been nowhere near as severe as anticipated anyway. So I think actually it's premature to be talking at all about the need for fiscal tightening. If we did have to do it, equally, I'm sure that there are plenty of areas where we could make savings in public expenditure, not the sort of petty penny pinching as I see it on things like public sector pay or the foreign aid bill. The bigger picture is that public spending's been averaging about 40% of GDP since the Second World War. It was roughly that level before the pandemic struck. I think that surely has to be more than enough to fund those things where we see there is an important role for government. So there are things like public services and the sort of infrastructure projects that, for one reason or another, the private sector is not willing to touch. But there must be plenty of other areas where I think the state could step back and we could make substantial savings. So rather than taking it for granted that the level of public spending is a given and can only ever go up, I would look at both the spending side and the tax side and see where savings can be made.
Miatta, I mean, if you feel that the kind of level of debt that we have is not a problem for, many years, decades, then there's no real need to increase taxes, right?
So I think I'd say two things. I think the reason in the end that we will have to think about tax rises is what I hope comes on the other side of this recovery is not just stabilizing back to the old normal, but reconsidering our social settlement, reconsidering things like social security and the level of income protection we provide for people, and indeed the public services, social care being a classic example in the context of an aging society. And I think in order to do that, we're going to have to be confident that we are able to fund that stuff, which requires us to think about the way that we tax, I would argue, in the most progressive way. So I think actually the issue is less the deficit in dealing with that, but the social settlement that we want to come out of this. Everyone says that we've got better. We've got to deal with some of the big structural problems that the pandemic has shown a spotlight on, inequality being one, but I'd argue how denuded some of our social protections have been another. If we need to do that, there is no way we can do that without confronting the question of, what we tax and what we spend. So I think we're going to have to do it anyway, irrespective of the question of the deficit. And I come back to, when the IMF chief economist is saying to you, a fiscal stimulus is not just economically sound policy, but it's also fiscal responsible policy, I think you've got to listen. Maybe whether the Economics Foundation says it, you listen less. But when the IMF is saying that actually this is the time to stimulate the economy and to spend in a big way, I think we take that seriously. And actually all economists, all the mainstream organizations, OECD, World Bank, are all saying the same thing. And I think it's probably the right conclusion.
Just to say, I think that's right in the very depths of the recession, but arguably that's precisely what we're doing this year, isn't it? We might be borrowing as much as 20% of GDP in order to support the economy through the crisis, and I don't think you'd find many economists who would disagree with that. I think the bigger question, though, is what happens when the economy does get back to normal? What is the appropriate level of state intervention then? What is the appropriate level of public spending and the appropriate level of taxation to fund that level of public spending? I think that longer term debate is sort of separate from, if you like, from the one we're having now. I don't believe we are in a fiscal crisis now. I'd much rather, of course, borrowing and debt were lower, but it's an inevitable consequence of the pandemic. But I don't think we should conclude from the fact that the government had to do a lot more during this particular crisis when the market economy was essentially shut down and extrapolate that to conclude that the government needs to do a lot more in more normal times.
Yes, I very much agree with that, and I agree with Miatta's point. Now is not the time to be worrying about borrowing. We should obviously spend money wisely, but we are in exceptional circumstances, and it is like wartime in some respects, and that requires wartime levels of borrowing, which is exactly what we're doing. I think that the challenge comes, as I say, when we're out of that in 2 or 3 years, possibly sooner. And there's a question here of if you like, of risk, which is the likelihood is interest rates will continue to remain low. And Miatta's point about the cost of borrowing is an important one. The risk is, what if we find ourselves with interest rates rising? That could be because the economy's growing strongly, in which case we have less to worry about. It could be that the world economy is growing strongly, but the UK, for whatever reason, is underperforming. And I don't think we can dismiss that risk. I think we can dismiss the possibility that we could have some pretty bumpy period ahead with Brexit and Scottish nationalism on the rise. And in those circumstances, if we haven't done something to rebuild a degree of fiscal credibility, my concern is that those borrowing costs will start to rise, and that the UK will be under greater scrutiny, perhaps, than we are used to, and that is not where we want to be. And that's why I think we are going to have to err on the side of caution and start to rebuild the sustainability of the public finances.
So, David, the rebuilding that we need, you've talked about tax rises. That's where we should be looking to do it. What specific taxes will Conservative MPs vote for?
That's a very good question. My worry is that if you want to raise substantial sums of money through taxes, although the temptation is to go on business taxes, for example, corporation tax rates and so on, that's probably more growth damaging than other options. You want to be able to use the big levers, income tax, national insurance contributions, and VAT. But the government has got itself on this hook of the tax lock, and I think that's really, really unfortunate. And I think if you're going to try to sort this out by using taxes, I'm afraid it's those big taxes that you have to increase. But whether Conservative MPs, waiving the manifesto pledge, will be prepared to support that, I really don't know.
So, Julian, just a question for you, which is, you've talked about maybe the COVID-related expenditure not really needing a kind of deficit reduction plan in the long term, but some of the kind of bigger structural problems like older age spending requiring us to look at spending cuts. So my question to you is a kind of reverse of David's question, which is, which spending cuts will Conservative MPs vote for to kind of have that sort of deficit reduction?
Yeah, so if I can just be cheeky and just come in a bit more on the interest rate point that David touched on, because I think that really is important. Obviously, other things being equal, a bigger stock of debt means that when interest rates rise, that's a bigger threat to the sustainability of the public finances. But I think we do need to step back and say, why might interest rates rise? I think it's far more likely to be because the economy is stronger, maybe inflation's a little bit higher, in which case the benefit of those economic changes will far offset and outweigh any increase in the interest bill. The other potential risk, as David I think was hinting at, was there's some sort of risk premium that's built into the UK public finances because we're seen as a worse bet than other countries. But it's worth stressing that even on the OBR's central numbers, our debt to GDP ratio is going to remain lower than that in Italy or Japan or France or the US. There's no obvious reason why we should be singled out. And without wanting to dwell too much on Brexit, I think there's actually good news on Brexit just around the corner. Some of the uncertainty that's held back investment in the UK is about to be lifted. On the question about the need for longer term reform, there's no easy answers here. I mean, the aging of the population is a problem. It's a nice problem to have, of course, but we do need to find some way to make sure that people in their older age do continue to receive good pensions, good healthcare, good adult social care, and so on. So simply dumping that problem on the private sector doesn't make the problem go away. People will still have to save more either personally or pay more in taxes to fund that care. But what I think we can do is look at healthcare and funding models elsewhere in the world, whether that's the best practice in the rest of Europe or in countries like Japan. And typically there is more involvement of the private sector there, whether that's through health insurance or whatever. So clearly the bills are not going to go away. The question is, what is the best way to finance them? And my personal view is that we shouldn't assume that the state is the only institution that can do this.
I've got a question now, which has come in from Alex Hamilton. Unfortunately, not the Alexander Hamilton, but he asks, how much scope is there really for tax rises when the tax burden is already at its highest level for some decades? Miatta, maybe you want to answer that.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I think there have to be two parts of it. I think we know that certain things we don't tax particularly well. We don't tax wealth particularly well. And so I think that's an easy thing that the government must look at in order to equalize how much we tax income versus how much we tax wealth. I think in the short term, there's probably quite a lot of scope to think about, some sectors and businesses have really outperformed and done very well through this pandemic. And there's a question about actually the extent to which you want to take a windfall out of excess profits that you could do in the short term. You can't do it sustainably in the long term. But then I think the third piece is that, politicians hate talking about taxation because everyone hates it. But I generally think there is an honest conversation that needs to be had that says, if there are certain things that we want collectively as a society, like an NHS free at the point of use, like a social care system, I'd argue, free at the point of use, like education of a high standard for our children, then actually we should all club in a little bit more to pay for that. But the social settlement, the thing that people get on the other side of it, has to be commensurate with the contribution that we want them to make. And I think the frustration for some of the public is, I don't mind paying my taxes if I feel like A, the money is spent well, and the public sector doesn't always do that. And secondly, I understand the settlement I'm getting. And I think because our settlement has been denuded and eroded, and there are parts of the country that don't feel that settlement applies to them, it's much harder to have the conversation about taxation. So I think the two have to come hand in hand, which is why I'll come back to, there's an opportunity for us to reset. You know, we've been trading off the settlement that came out of 1945 in the post-war period. We need to reset that settlement and then say, well, actually, that requires all of us to put a little bit more. And by the way, those that can pay a lot more should pay a lot more. But that's the kind of conversation I think we need to be having in order to address this. And then the final point, before I shut up, I'll make, Julian made the really good point, and he's right. The debate is not about whether, you know, what's the level of government spending to deal with COVID, because I think there's consensus that we need to spend now. The question is, what is the level of spending that we think we ought to be spending in the long term? And what I would say is that COVID is a crisis, but climate change is an equal crisis. The fact that living standards have been stagnant for a decade and are about to be hit again for another decade is a crisis. So we're not out of this yet. And I think government needs to be thinking about all of this in the round as it's thinking about the right level of spending in order to have that conversation with the public about what contribution needs to be made.
And David, just a question to you, which is, you know, let's go to the Laffer curve really, which is, you know, we're talking about raising rates for certain taxes to bring in more revenue. But of course, sometimes we can reduce rates and bring in more revenue. I mean, is there a chance for that perhaps?
Sometimes that can happen, but you know, by and large, you know, most taxes, if you increase the rates, you will get more revenue. There comes a point, obviously, where that ceases to be. I'm a little skeptical about some of the claims that can be made about how much money can be raised from capital gains tax, for example. I think, you know, we're closer to the revenue maximizing point than is sometimes recognised. But the idea that there's a sort of easy option here that we can just cut taxes and the revenue will come rolling in, I just don't really believe that. I think, building on what Miatta has said, you know, we are going to have to think long and hard about our tax system. I don't believe there is scope to reduce the overall burden of taxes, unfortunately. If we are going to increase taxes, we need to do it in a way that is least damaging possible, and find a way in which we can do that. And that's not going to be easy, but a debate about what a sensible tax system looks like, what can be both effective in raising large sums of money, but also economically efficient and not anti-enterprise, not anti-growth. That is not going to be easy, but we are going to have to address some of those issues. That means, I'm afraid, taking on a few vested interests as well. But that is where we, I think, are going to have to go if we want to put the public finances on a sustainable footing. And particularly building on a point that Julian made a little earlier, you know, we know that in the long term, the demographics are going to work against us, and that is going to make it expensive. And you know, we are going to have to address some of those issues before very much longer.
Unfortunately, I left the call there, so I missed some of your very eloquent words.
I kept talking till you reappeared, right?
So final thoughts really from you, Julian, from what you've heard.
Yeah, well, I think this is exactly the sort of debate that we need to be having. I think we all recognise here what the problems are. We might have different solutions to those problems, but at least we're talking about the right things. And I was particularly struck by something I think actually David said about about where we are in the political cycle. I think that hopefully these sorts of issues will come up in the next election campaign. And instead of it being about Brexit, it'll be about the sort of the bigger social issues, the social settlement, as Miatta would put it, and the longer term demographic pressures on the budget and how we finance those. So I think this is a debate that can wait, in the sense that we don't need to be thinking about raising taxes over the next few years, but it's not a debate that we can put off altogether. And the more thinking that we can do over the next few years, and hopefully feed this into the next election campaign, I think that'd be really, really helpful.
Thank you everyone for watching Bright Blue TV. we went a fortnight on some of the biggest issues, bringing together thinkers from across the political spectrum. A big thank you to Julian, David, and Miatta